I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Superintendent Danny Atkins. I'm the chair of the Superintendent's Advisory Council. We have several folks in person with us today, but I would also like to welcome everyone joining us online today. With that being said, we've got some really good presentations, I think, taking place. We have Mr. Todd Allen and Mr. Brian Perry to discuss some of the new legislation with us, and then Ms. Heather Bushelman to talk about, actually, it's another piece of legislation in our counselor's time. So we have a pretty good agenda today. So with that being said, I'll see. Is Commissioner, is he available?
He's not in him yet, but I'll let you know if he shows up.
Okay. Ms. Stein, would you go ahead and take care of roll call?
Yes, thank you, Chair Atkins. If you're joining us virtually, please make certain that your camera is enabled and that you unmute when you hear your name, please. Chuck Abel, Danny Atkins,
Present.
Carrie Ballinger, present. Doug Buchanan,
Present.
Doug Bennett, Joe Berkeley, Tom Cochran,
Present.
Matthew Constant, Robbie Fletcher, Michael Ford, David Gilliam, Sanford Holbrook, Damian Johnson,
Present.
Mark Kopp,
Present.
Matthew Madding,
Present.
Misty Middleton,
I'm here, present.
Marty Polio,
Present.
Jason Radford, Rick Richardson, Wayne Roberts, Tim Spencer,
Present.
Bill Thorpe, Robert Tuck, Henry Webb, and Leonard Whalen.
Present.
Thank you. That concludes our call.
Again, thank everyone for joining us. The minutes, they were sent out earlier. If you need them, Ms. Stein can drop those in the chat box again. Again, take a few minutes to look at those if you haven't already. And once everyone's ready, we'll need a motion to approve. Superintendent Cochran makes a motion to approve the minutes. We need a second. Superintendent Balance, seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Minutes are approved. So that leads us to our first presentation today with Mr. Todd Allen and Mr. Brian Perry. We've asked everyone to submit some questions. I'm not sure exactly how many we have. I know we have at least one. They have a presentation prepared for us about new legislation. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to them. And thank you, gentlemen, for showing up today and sharing the information you have with us. So thank you.
Sure. Yeah, everyone, we actually don't have a presentation. We're just here to answer questions if there are any. Before we get to questions, I just want to remind everybody that we have issued guidance, non-regulatory guidance, for the bills that were enacted with emergency clause for all some of that legislation. That's already posted. We will be pushing out the rest of the guidance for bills that do not have emergency clause. Those bills go into effect Thursday, the 29th of June. And so we'll try to get that posted early. And so our policy advisors are in the process of finishing up the first draft of that. So I hope by the end of this week we'll start editing that. So some of the questions we may not have answers to yet. We're still working on that guidance, but I'll drop that link in the chat so you don't have it. You know where to find it.
But I also know, again, thank you for having us here today. The question when you back to the get for us as we go through all of those guidance documents the score. In the field, on the ground, doing work, and making questions that we didn't necessarily. So hearing the feedback, questions on these topics. Emergency legislation, and also to inform now. Any question, whether it's here, you can later, you want to shoot those questions to us. We welcome those with our investigation concern, so it's helpful. So it's superintendent has a question. Several others.
Fine, we have at least one question.
Yes, and I shared those with Brian and Todd as well, but we can open it up to the team or to the members and they can ask those questions if you'd like to.
Real quick, something I'd like to say, Mr. Allen, Mr. Perry, we have all been leaning on our board attorneys, our local attorneys, but we get so many different interpretations. So we're all just really, I guess, much as you guys are, still trying to interpret it and still searching for how to address these new laws and make sure we're in compliance.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Superintendent. I think that for some of the legislation, some of it, it leaves a lot of questions, even for council itself, and these school districts in a position that they have to calculate all the risks to make a decision on changing the net. It's not unlike. But point well taken. Happy with anything we can provide some guidance and clarity, just understanding when we do so. Some of these laws are issues, so we can do our best to guide a school district in a way that perhaps would be less risk involved.
So with that, we'll turn it over, open the floor for questions for Mr. Allen and Mr. Perry.
Guys, just a note, they're having trouble hearing. So,
You speak up.
I don't think it's a mic, I think the central mic is what we should be.
Natasha and Christie, we can hear Danny really well. We just can't hear Todd and Brian.
But typically I take offense to that if my wife had said that.
That's okay, Danny. That's me. You're good.
That's almost a positive comment. Thank you.
Hey, you had a birthday yesterday, so I guess happy birthday.
Thank you.
So I think some of the questions that we received, I'll try to project a little bit more toward that central line, were related to House Bill 5, House Bill 530, and there may have been some of around Senate Bill 150 as well. So Natasha, if you want to guide us on any of those questions, that's fine. I know I saw the specific pieces of legislation, but maybe questions providing any clarity related to that. Feel free to jump in and say, well, my question was really something else. So House Bill 5 overall goes back and tweaks a lot of the reforms to the juvenile justice system. Most of those pieces are related to the court system, how juveniles will be processed through the court system. As many of you all know, that legislation was really sweeping back in around 2010, 12, maybe. I'm guessing on the date. But it's been in place for several years now. It's what provided the fair teams that your staff participate on. It changed a lot of the processing for juveniles. And the overall goal was to try to intervene and prevent them from moving into the court system. There could be some type of intervention to prevent them from going into the court system. That was the original goal. But I think, time reveals little tweaks that may be necessary along the way. So a few that are related to school systems specifically that you all should be aware of. The court designated worker will now they're required to contact the school district to gather information prior to them putting together a diversion agreement. So you all will need to identify someone in your school district who the court designated worker will be responsible for communicating with to get that information about a student before they put together their diversion plans for that student. I will note that FERPA does specifically allow you all to do this. There is an exception in FERPA that allows sharing of information with the juvenile justice system, but there is a specific provision in FERPA that says the person getting the information needs to certify in writing that they're not going to share it with anyone else unless the parent or eligible student consents. I would assume that KSBA will probably push something out with standard language related to that in their policy, but if we can help you all with that, we're happy to do so. I also made a note to communicate over to the administrative office of the courts to let them know FERPA does allow that, but there is this exception. School districts are going to be asking for designated workers to certify. They're not going to further share information. It also has a little bit more accountability for the FAIR team related to truancy. So when a student is referred to the FAIR team for truancy, if the FAIR team does not take any action within 30 days, then they have to report to the court why they didn't take any action. And they also have to report whether they've been meeting, who's been missing meetings, things of that nature. Now, I don't know this for sure, but I presume that's related to maybe there wasn't a lot of action being taken. Maybe FAIR teams were not acting as quickly as people had hoped on the matter of truancy. So this is obviously directed to address that. All of your school districts have somebody who sits on the FAIR team. So just an FYI that kind of added level of accountability is added for. There's also a little bit of a tweak for violent felony offenses. So if the juvenile commits what is considered a violent felony offense, they can be held down to 48 hours. Previously, it was 24 hours before they had to go before the court. That is if they are over 10 years old, or under 10 years old. Applies, but just to make a differentiation between those violent felony offenses versus other status.
That's all in House Bill 3, not 5.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
House Bill 5 is the urban relatives. There's a lot of.
And somewhat related to that was House Bill 538. This is specifically related to the school district and discipline of students. So I think what really caused House Bill 538 to be born was a bit of a confusion around how long students spent. So we have for many years had a state statute a requirement that if a student brings a weapon to school, they have to be expelled for a period of 1 year. But that can be amended in writing on a case-by-case basis based on the student. The reason that language is in place, because federal ESSA requires all states to have a law in place that requires expulsion of a student for at least 1 year if they bring a firearm to school, but it can be amended on a case-by-case basis. Around the same time that House Bill 538 was working through the system, there was a request submitted to the Office of Attorney General asking, can school districts expel a student more than a year? There has become an understanding, I think, that school districts were limited to 1 year expulsion. Even some school districts were thinking that they were only limited to the current school year. So they expel a student now, it would only be a few more days for the current school year. That was never the case in law. School districts always had the ability to expel for more than 12 months and beyond the current school year, but there was some confusion out there related to that. That Attorney General's opinion came out just days before 538 was passed, and it clarified accurately. School districts do have the ability to expel a student for more than 1 year, and it can go into the next school year, but it cautions school districts to say that the discipline imposed on a student through expulsion has to be commensurate with the offense that is. So we don't want to have arbitrary and kind of draconian expulsions that don't match the offense that is. Whenever a school board does that, then they expose themselves to the student bringing a lawsuit, the constitutional right to education to violate. Whatever the offense was, didn't match the expulsion, term of the expulsion that they were exposed to. Changes in 538 added, in addition to bringing a weapon to school, also threats that pose a danger to the well-being of students. So 538 said that you have to expel a student for at least 12 months. They bring a weapon to school, or they threaten, make threats that pose a danger to the well-being of students, staff, etc. There's also now a new kind of tweak in 538. Previously, it said that the school district always had the ability to amend that expulsion period on a case-by-case basis. And of course, that's so that the district doesn't have to impose a sanction that isn't in line with the offense that permitted. But now the school district isn't, at least by language of 538, allowed to impose an expulsion less than 12 months for those two types of offenses: weapons, threats that, making threats that pose a danger to the well-being of students and staff. This is this puts school districts in a bit of a precarious situation. Because obviously, the school board does not want to expose itself to a lawsuit by a student who is expelled for a year that maybe they in fact did make a threat, but the threat, the circumstances, if you look at all of the circumstances around it, don't justify a year's worth of expulsion. And that goes back to that Attorney General opinion that was issued just days before this law passed that said discipline can't be arbitrary and it has to be consistent with instance. So in that situation, obviously I recommend for any school district that's going to expel a student that they work closely with the board council related to that. There may need to be some conversations had about whether or not we stick with this hard and fast rule and potentially expose the school district to suit by the student, or whether we go ahead and move forward with this rule and see how that plays out. For the offense of making threats that pose a danger to the well-being of students and staff, the law clearly provides that that has to be proven by clear and convincing evidence. And I think there was a question of what does that really mean? What is clear and convincing evidence? So this is a very legal answer. The Kentucky Supreme Court has held that clear and convincing evidence does not necessarily mean that it's uncontradicted proof. It is sufficient if there's proof of a probative and substantive nature carrying the weight of evidence to convince the ordinarily prudent-minded person. So we have several levels of evidence. A preponderance of the evidence means that look at it, you can find that it's more likely than not that something occurred. Clear and convincing is a little bit above that, but again, it doesn't mean that it's uncontradicted. So as your board goes through these types of expulsion hearings, this is specifically related to the threat. Obviously, you have good board counsel out there who are working on that, and they're going to explain to your board what clear and convincing evidence is that they need to rely upon in order to make a finding with this. But again, that's something, I appreciate the question, and we'll be sure to include that in our guidance that we push out House Bill 558. It also requires that school boards adopt policies to discipline students who assault students or personnel off of property if doing so disrupts the educational process. The law already required that your school districts have policies in place to discipline a student for assault on campus, on school property, but this now is going to extend off of school property if it can show that that resulted in disruption of education. There is this provision in the law now, and this is an interesting one. You know, I talked about that whole piece that said you cannot apply expulsion less than 12 months. But then if we jump down a little bit further in the law, it says in lieu of expulsion, the district can provide an alternate education setting for the student instead of expelling them. Now, that's, you know, most districts, even after they expel a student, providing services to the students. But what's interesting is several places in the law talks about upon the expiration of expulsion. Going back, this law now requires 30 days before students' expulsion ends. The board has to review that, determine if they're going to continue the expulsion or if they're going to put the student in an alternative setting. Again, I think that is probably a legal hurdle that boards and districts need to discuss in detail with their board counsel, because arguably that exposes a student to what we call double jeopardy. If the board has decided that a period of a year and a half expulsion is what the student, what is commensurate with the instance, at the end of that year and a half, unless the student has done something else, if the board then comes back and expels them again, I think that absolutely is going to expose your board to some type of legal action by that student who says, I've now been subject to double jeopardy. When you think about that in terms of our criminal justice system, obviously, if a defendant goes before a jury, judge, sentenced under that system, once they serve that sentence, that's it. They're not subject to another sentence for the same crime. And we can apply the same logic in this situation. So I think that's something that's going to have to be very carefully navigated by school districts. And there are also some provisions in here, processes for principal removal of a student from a classroom, either temporarily or permanently. Just note that, obviously I think that KSBA can push out some model policies to your school districts to implement this, but it's going to be very important that if you have principals removing students, especially permanent, these provisions, that's done consistently. That's a situation where they're having to explain why one student got one type of application. And then finally, I think that what's really important to note here is that the law continues to say that for students with disabilities under the IDEA or Section 4, federal law governs all of that. So you need to follow federal law, which, as you know, whenever a student is disciplined under IDEA, there are certain processes that you have to go through, manifestation determinations, determining where the student is placed, things of that nature. So all of that's still going to be placed for students with disabilities. On that removal that principals can do, either temporarily or permanently, it's going to be very important for them to also understand the additional provisions and protections that IDEA provides so that they know the student is a student with disability, that additional protections apply to them. These new provisions in 538 are not going to cover those situations for students. I'll pause there. That's not a high level overview.
Any further questions on 538?
So as I said, we'll push out the best of the guidance in early June. We're hoping to get out that first week of June to give you all a full month to get ready for the silly ball going to go back on the 29th. But please do let us know if you see something that's missing, if you still have questions about any of the legislation. We will certainly be happy to push out a FAQ or anything like that. Missing stuff. So just please let us know.
And then I was also, I think, I sent the 150.
50
No.
from this group.
Okay.
It was House Bill 3 and House Bill 538.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Council, would love to thank you guys for coming, giving us, sharing the information with us. Thank you, Mr. Allen. Thank you, Mr. Perry. We're very excited you're able to come and share some insight into some questions, answer some questions and some insight into the new legislation. So thank you very much.
And again, please, if anybody has additional questions, things that you're struggling with in your school district, please send those to us because they'll be helpful to us in developing our guidance. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no further questions for Mr. Perry and Mr. Allen, we'll move into Ms. Heather Busselman and her presentation. So I think we do have a PowerPoint with that one, am I correct? Okay, so we'll move into that and welcome Ms. Busselman.
Well, thank you for letting me join this afternoon. I know your time is busy and very precious. So I'm just going to go over our data analysis and overall summary of the report and the spreadsheet that each of you submitted. If you think back to November 1st, every year, you submit the school counselor and the school-based mental health provider use of time. So it's a spreadsheet that we send out, and every counselor, school psychologist, school social worker, or school-based mental health therapist you hire in your district, they will fill this out. So November 1st for this coming year, it will be sent out again for you all to complete by that date. And this is based on the legislation for KRS 1584416. So we'll start with our school counselors first. We were very excited because being our second year collecting this data, this year we had 100% participation. So that is a huge increase from the first year of over 24% because all of our districts did submit data. Now, there were a few that had to be taken out because it still was not correctly reported, but it wasn't a lot. So we're getting there to where it's more consistent and with fidelity. So we had over 1,800 responses from your school counselors. 39% were from elementary, 22% were from the middle schools, and then 35% were from your high schools. Keeping in mind, some of those school counselors, they do serve different levels. For example, K through 8 or K through 12. So when we think about our anecdotal data, this was the first year to support our quantitative data that we do take. We were talking to students across the state. Our KDE Student Advisory Council gave input, Lieutenant Governor Coleman's, all of those student mental health groups gave feedback, and then some other groups through KDE that do get to meet with students. And the message is the same, which to me, these are our number one stakeholders to be listening to of what our students need and what they are crying out for, essentially. But they do recognize the amount of responsibilities placed on the school counselors. They see them running meetings, building schedules. A lot of them mentioned they might meet with them about college and career advising, but they really would like to have access to them for more mental health and just other daily stresses and needs for, friendship issues, peer conflict, maybe some family home dynamics happening. They are requesting more access to their counselors. Many of them reported a lot of their peers that do request to see their school counselor, they are waiting weeks to months to be able to see the school counselor. This is alarming because the school counselor is in the building all day, every day, typically, and they're not getting to see their students. So that backs up our data that we are going to show that our students are telling us they're not seeing their school counselors based on what our own counselors are reporting for how they are spending their time. Okay, so we also cross-reference the Kentucky School Security Marshals report that you are very familiar with. So in regards to the school counselors, over 93% of our schools do have a certified school counselor, which is great because it's recommended you have to have one based on the funding that you do receive. So 56% of our districts, they did report they're not yet meeting the ratio that is in law from one provider to 250 students. So right now in Kentucky, we are making gains. We're still not where we want to be yet, though, statewide. Right now, the overall ratio is about one provider to about 350 students. So we're getting there, but even that ratio, that's one reason why our students are not seeing their counselors. Their caseloads are too large. They're not able to focus in on those 250 students for not just college advising and career advising, but also for academic counseling and other mental health needs that the students may have. And so, and one thing we want to consider when we do think about their use of time is 96% of schools said that school counselors do document their time with students. Keep in mind, though, they're not necessarily talking to the school counselor. So we really want to think about moving forward with our report is, do our administrators in our buildings, do they see their school counselors' use of time? Do they see their hours they're spending directly with students, maybe in meetings, possibly, training staff about different strategies? So that would be something to think about moving forward is, do they really know what their use of time looks like versus just assuming they're keeping it? And so in thinking about the student ratio, we do want it to be, of course, one provider to 250 students. However, thinking about that, we need to think about what the school counselors are doing in their buildings. We could have that ratio met, which is great, but if they're not seeing students directly, it really doesn't matter because they could still have the ratio met, but not ever be seeing kids. So we really want to think about that as we move forward. So they did report their funding. Most of them did spend their time in one building. Some have a few on multiple sites, but not many. For school counselors, most of them do have one building. They might be half between one building and half with another building. More than 70% of them are funded by local dollars. About 7% are funded by federal and 16% are through state funding. Now, this is important to think about because as we move forward, when ESSER funds do go away, as superintendents, that will be something to look at for your allocations and your funding. Because right now, this influx of money has allowed a lot of these providers to help that ratio decrease to help others see students. So we'll need to think about that going forward in the next year or two. Okay, so how are they spending their time? So, like I said, based on the Kentucky law that was passed a few years ago, it is recommended they are to see students directly 60% of their time. So that would be they are teaching a large group class, they are coordinating small groups, or they're seeing students one-on-one individually counseling. So there are inappropriate activities that counselors are not recommended to actually do that we'll see in a minute. But of those, about 1/3 of their activities are reported as inappropriate. And we'll see a list of those in just a second. But based on I'm sorry, can you go back? Thank you. For the appropriate services, though, about 50% of their time was reported to actually see students. So that's higher than it was last year, but as you can see, it's still not even reaching that 60% at the very minimum of what they are recommended to do. So that's again in front of students face to face. The remainder of their appropriate time was spent using the indirect services. And those are meetings that they hold on behalf of students. So that would be if they meet with a teacher about a student to discuss behavior strategies, if they're meeting with the administration about their data and their counseling program, they're a part of the MTSS team. They should have a large voice within that team, academically, social, emotionally, and for college and career readiness. And then there is an other category where this is typically where we look at, are they analyzing their counselor data? Are they planning their program based on what the data is telling them? And then their school functioning tasks. We understand, I just came out of my building a year and a half ago. There are school functioning tasks that school counselors do need to do. For example, bus duty every morning, possibly supervising a lunch period a couple times a week. So there are things we do know to help the school function. All staff, are recommended to do. Okay, so this table represents the inappropriate activities that school counselors are actually doing. And when we talk about the inappropriate activities, it just means this is what's recommended that they are not supposed to do any longer. Now that we have shifted away from guidance counselors, they are now school counselors, which means they are in front of students, they are data driven, they are proactive in everything they are supposed to be doing. So we are still working on making sure counselors know that, number one, and then all administrators understand the shift in their role, especially with what our data and research is telling us now that our students are needing. So you can see on the table, building schedules is the number one activity. And what that means is they're in Infinite Campus typing in all the schedules. If they're meeting with a student about their schedule, that's completely fine. But actually having to sit for hours and entering in all that is really not appropriate for a counselor to do. ARC chairperson, of course, is always the big one. They are not supposed to be chairing ARC meetings. They can go to the meeting and be an advocate for a student and talk about data, interventions, and then 504 coordinator, same thing. They're really not supposed to be keeping up with that paperwork, delegating all those different, roles to the different people and the different staff members. So those are always the two big ones that we usually get questions about, but they're really not supposed to be the chairperson for either one. Of course, supervising like lunches, common areas. And like I said, we do know there are school functioning tasks, But if it is hours that they're spending supervising versus they could be seeing students who need them, that's when it becomes inappropriate, because we don't want them showing all these hours just supervising versus they could be seeing students and running small groups and providing tier one services for all students. Um, Coordinating testing, they're really not recommended to be the building assessment coordinator, because again, it's just really building the schedule, delegating again. But as a counselor, they do need to understand how to analyze test scores and use that data to drive some of their counseling services, but to coordinate all of it is not recommended. For records, to maintain them, send them, entered into Infinite Campus, anything like that that's really logistical, they're not recommended to do. And then data, counselors are supposed to be keeping data to drive their counseling program. And really, the data they're looking at is for the bigger picture within your schools and your whole district. And then they see how their counseling program can support that data to increase or decrease something. But to just enter it or just to maintain other data really not affiliated with the counseling program is not recommended. Any kind of paperwork, if they're the ones copying paperwork, taking it in, having to go file it, it's not recommended. When you have new students come into your building, they are absolutely, hopefully meeting those families, possibly touring them, talking about the services they may offer, but to just coordinate and file paperwork is not recommended. Um, and then there were some tasks associated with the pandemic, of course, that they had to do as far as covering more classes than they've ever had to do before. And some of that, of course, we will see decrease as we do move forward. Okay. So some things to consider, because we know, funding is always an issue. So we want to consider things outside of just hiring more people or trying to get more money to figure out what do we do to ensure our number one stakeholder, our kids, are seeing counselors. So the first thing to think about is your allocations. All of you have allocations for your districts, to think about what your school counselors and your mental health providers are doing to see kids. Are they in front of students? Do they know your families? What can we do to allow them access to those professionals to be able to see them versus waiting weeks to months like we're being told they are? The role of the school counselor and the tasks that are assigned to them should be examined. Like all those inappropriate activities are really not supposed to be doing as a district, as a school, considering, talking to your counselors, your administrators, and just collaboratively, thinking about here's where we are. So what's something we could slowly progress to move forward to take this away from the counselor so they can see more students, but then who else would do it? So again, that's a collaborative conversation to have because ultimately, when you think about what school counselors offer and the topics students are going to talk to them about, there's not usually anybody else in the building that could see those kids. And that's something to consider is when certain issues happen, who else would see those students besides your school counselor if they're in meetings or filing paperwork or building schedules? And then consider the supports the district may need to grow towards meeting these needs. So just thinking about, are there any trainings or coaching opportunities or that we could offer to help your counselors just understand this is your role? Because we do know it is a shift for a lot of our counselors who have been, those guidance roles before, because everything has changed in the past several years. But just understanding how could we move towards that and how are other districts doing it? Because we do have a lot of districts that have shifted into those more appropriate tasks for our counselors. Okay, so now is your mental health provider data. So we split them up because ultimately your school counselors have different recommendations than the other mental health providers. So to put them all in one big category is pretty difficult, to be honest with you, because they serve different roles in every school they're in. So we had to separate them out. So these are your school psychologist, your mental health therapist you hire at your district, and any school social workers you may have. So we had over 1,700 responses from these providers. Most were from elementary, but we did have 22% from high school, 18 from middle school. Um, Several of them indicated that they are other qualified mental health providers, meaning there is a variety of certifications for all of these providers. And so thinking through that, it sometimes is difficult to figure out based on their certification how they can really see students before requiring parent consent, a certain amount of caseload, medical need, things like that. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on with your allocations and who you are hiring and what certification they have, just for liability reasons, especially. Um, so for your mental health providers, most of them say that they are within one building, but many of them do serve multiple sites. So you may have one school psych that does serve 5 schools or 3 schools. So this is where we see a lot more of them seeing more students at a variety of buildings versus just housed at one. Okay. Thank you. So how are they spending their time? Here's something to keep in mind about these providers. Their recommendations nationally from their organizations are different from school counselors. Right now in Kentucky, the regulations talks about 1 to 250 school counselors or mental health providers. That's a huge stepping stone. However, nationally recommendations are not 1 to 250 for some of these providers. For example, a school psychologist is technically 1 to 500. A school-based therapist is typically not over 30. So those are some things to keep in mind as you do hire some of these providers and see actually what they're doing in our buildings. So for the tasks assigned to them, they're spending about 30% of their time individually counseling students. So that's not a lot when you think about 100% of their day and what they're doing. But we do know 14% of that time they are consulting with stakeholders. So they are meeting with families, administrators. They a lot of times will serve on the MTSS teams. They usually are a liaison between school and community-based resources as well. But very minimal are they assisting with crisis situations, behavior intervention plans. Very minimal. Are they collaborating with school counselors, or coordinating small group counseling, or providing trainings for families and staff? Because a lot of times their skill set may be a little bit different. So we want to make sure we do offer them opportunities of what that might look like to, of course, help our families know what they could do for their students. So school social workers and psychologists, they typically spend more time consulting on behalf of students. Whereas your other mental health providers, they will typically individually counsel students. So those are your therapists. And of course, they do need parent consent and they typically have a medical need if they are seeing a student, if they are a therapist. So that's something else to think about in your buildings, is just to be safe when you are thinking about your allocations and to make sure they do know liability reasons and legal considerations for when they can actually see a student. Um, School social workers do spend more time than other providers by referring resources to families, which makes sense. And then school psychologists, they typically spent more time serving on those school-based teams versus these other two providers. Because typically, if you think about here in Kentucky, a lot of them are funded through special education funding. So they are the ones typically who do discuss, MTSS supports, interventions, the data, and of course they serve on those ARC meetings. So, so something to think about. You can go ahead to the next slide. As we think about considerations for their use of time. You can go to the next slide, please.
Heather, did it switch for you?
No, not yet.
Let me go back and I'll try again.
Okay, and if not, it's fine.
I'm showing it on as the recommendations to consider.
Okay, yeah, it's just not switching for me. It's okay though. So some things to consider, especially with these mental health providers outside of your school counselors are number one, what does it look like in your buildings collaboratively in your districts? How are they working together? It's great. A lot of us do have an influx now of therapists and school social workers and school psychs and school counselors. But what we're finding is a lot of districts are struggling to really understand what should they be doing in our buildings. When does parent consent come into play? When does tier one, tier two? So it's kind of confusing because they do have similar activities, but they all have their own lane as well. So we are going to release some guidance about that just to help districts kind of navigate what that looks like. Just so that way we are not kind of overstepping our bounds with our mental health providers, and ultimately how are they enhancing the school counseling program, because school counselors will see all kids, but how are these mental health providers enhancing those services? And something else to keep in mind as well is the type of certification to qualify to be able to be hired for your positions. Some social work certifications do require supervision to counsel a student, where some do not, depending on the type of school they've had and how and their type of certification. So just be aware of that, as you do post, positions and you're looking at allocations and things like that, just to help yourself, follow the legal and ethical considerations. Um, but just moving forward, if your district does need any support or any help, again, none of this is ever punitive, and I hope you know that. This is just helping us do what's best for kids. They want to see providers, which is to me, I think, amazing. They're asking for that. So we just want to offer any support or help we can. If it's a training, a workshop, a coaching with your district or certain schools or administrators, I'd be happy to help. So please email me if you need anything. And even if you want to know how other districts are starting to get this process going to where they are seeing more students, and I'd be happy to share some with you. So, and that's all I had.
So, I want to thank Ms. Bushman for sharing the information. We'll open the floor for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. This is Michael Ford in Russell County. Just a couple of questions. I apologize if I missed this, and I appreciated the presentation. The stat regarding weeks or months before students were seen by a guidance counselor, was that information provided by the guidance counselor themselves, or was that other sources, or did you say that was provided by students? Because I feel like my colleagues in the room would share what I'm going to say next. I never see that happening. My guidance counselors would stay after school before it was weeks or months before they didn't see a kid. So I would like to know where that information came from. And then secondly, was it a work group of current active guidance counselors that developed that list of inappropriate activities? Where was that generated from? Who identified that as inappropriate activities?
Yeah, great questions. So as far as seeing students, all of our student groups said the same thing. It wasn't every student, obviously, but the majority of them did share they are waiting a long time to see their school counselors. They see them like around the building, but a lot of them, and of course, this is coming from middle to high school age students too. But they are reporting they would like to see their school counselors just more accessible for when they have mental health needs, when they have stress, when they have any other issue. And they actually did make the comment they kind of wished their school counselors could see more of them about some mental health needs they have versus college and career advising. So the students even were telling us that, and I had to remind them that they do have to be experts in academic, college, career, and social emotional learning, which leads into mental health. So they have to be experts in all three. But it was across the board. Our students were telling us the access is very minimal. For our high school counselors, that's kind of what the feedback we're getting as well. They are seeing less kids for mental health needs than they would like to be. So, and then as far as the inappropriate activities, so that is based off our national organization, ASCA, the American School Counselor Association. So that is created and it's updated every year based on news, seasoned school counselors, and then of course the organization, they have people who oversee everything for school counselors. And actually our regulation in Kentucky is based off some of what they have recommended before, with the 1 to 250. Even though they've got the other mental health providers in it, it's actually what school counselors are recommended to do just themselves. So that's where that list has come from. They have and I'm happy to share it if you'd like me to. There's a table that has a list of appropriate and inappropriate activities for school counselors. So that's where the shift the past 7 to 10 years is coming from.
Yeah, thank you. In your work across the state, we several years ago with the Race to the Top grant with our educational cooperative had a college career counselor. And then as a result of that 4-year grant, we realized how valuable that was. And so we have kept that position ever since that. And that certainly helps alleviate that, takes that role. Not that they're still not, as you referenced, is not still involved in that, but I think that directs students if it's a graduation question relative to a scholarship or college application, they know that they can direct that to the CCR counselor, and then the other counselors can still do some of that other stuff. And yes, I would like to see that list. That would be great information.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, absolutely send it. Yeah, thank you for your questions. And I do
Thank you.
appreciate you keeping your college and career coach and counselor, because I know a lot of schools are shifting to that where the other ones can focus more on some of the more mental health needs as much as they can do with counselors. So yeah, so I appreciate you all keeping that on. It's a great position.
Anyone else have another question? Ms. Bushwood? If not, then we'll thank Ms. Blumen for her presentation, again, sharing her information. And again, if there are any more questions, anything that we and the council can help with, or we can put together something for our next meeting, which is going to be September 20th. There will be an in-person option for that as well here in the boardroom at KDE. So if there are any questions you have, please send those to me, Mrs. Stein, and we'll make sure we'll get those addressed and get some information gathered for that. With that being said, I do want to thank Ms. Stein and Ms. Staper for helping put the agendas together and organizing questions and putting together presentations and those types of things. One last call for questions or input to the council.
I'm sorry, when did you say next meeting was going to be?
September 20th, and we will get, Ms. Baker will get an invite out on that one fairly soon. And there will be an in-person option here. So I think that's important. That gives us an opportunity to meet and ask those questions that may be lingering in our minds. And again, just gives us an opportunity to I guess, share information with each other too. So we would certainly want to offer that in-person option. Okay, if there's nothing else, I guess we need a motion to adjourn.
Lenny Whalen, I so move.
Second,
Second.
all in favor? Aye.
All right.
We are adjourned. Thank you. Thank everyone for joining us. And again, thank you for your time.